Hello and welcome again to my YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Nginx, particularly how we can use it as a load balancer. So we're going to set up Nginx as a load balancer to load balance a Node.js application, and we're also going to add an SSL to the load balancer. But before we get into that, let's talk about Nginx. So what's Nginx? So Nginx is an open source software. It's used as a web server and a reverse proxy. It also has more use cases outside that can be used for caching, load balancing, video streaming. It can also be used as an email server. So a lot of things that can be done with Nginx, a lot of things to explore in the Nginx space. But Nginx is particularly known because of its performance. It's very fast compared to other web server alternatives. It's easy to set up and configure. Don't need to hassle too much to get it set up. And resource utilization is very optimal. So the Nginx, the most basic use case of Nginx is a web server. So let's look into that quickly. So let's say a client, that's your web browser, needs to render a web page. So it sends a request to a server to get that web page. Now that request is sent to a web server, and that web server could be running in Nginx. So if it's running in Nginx, what Nginx does is looks up the file that is requested and then sends the client that file. So very simple. The web browser requests a file, Nginx looks for the file and sends the file back to the client. But in this tutorial, what we're going to be looking at is Nginx as a load balancer. So how Nginx operates as a load balancer, it's quite similar. So your web browser makes a request to an API. Then what happens when it gets to Nginx? So Nginx forwards that request to either one of the backend servers that has been connected to it. So whichever one it sends to sends the response back. That response is then forwarded to the clients. Okay. So this is how Nginx operates as a load balancer, and in similar fashion, it can also operate as a reverse proxy as well. So if you don't want to expose your backend server, put Nginx in front of its server as a reverse proxy, so the clients don't know where the real server is. They don't see the server, they only see Nginx. So yeah, that is a quick overview of Nginx. Now let's get into the code. So firstly, what we're going to be doing is setting up our backend application. So we're going to be using Node.js for this. It's just going to be a simple Express app. So I have my index.js. Firstly, let me install the packages we're going to be using. So we're going to be using Express, and we're also going to be using EJS. So those are the two packages that we're going to be using. Once we've had that installed, good, we can close this off. Now, next thing we're going to do, let's set up the server. So first, we're going to import Express. Now, once we have Express installed, we're going to set up an environment variable, server index. So we'll know which server is being called by Nginx. Let's call it server index. Then now let's initialize our Express app. Express. Next, we're going to set our view engine, and for that, we're going to be using EJS. That's going to be EJS. And now let's set up a catch-all route // So we have our requests, response. Then we're just going to render going to render a home page with, so we'll set that up shortly, and next we'll set our variable pass to the view that server index. Just copy this, paste it over here. Now we just listen on port 3000. Okay, then we plug this to the console. Server running on port 3000. Okay, perfect. Now let's set up our view. Folder, views. Okay, so here we have the HTML code for our home page. So I've already written that beforehand, so this is not an HTML tutorial, but yeah, it's pretty basic stuff. That's pretty basic web page. So we have that. Yeah, this should be home.ejs. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I guess that's okay. Now I'm going to add a Docker file because we're going to be running this with Docker, and we're also going to be running Nginx with Docker rather than installing that on our system. But you could also install Nginx on your system if you want to, but it's much easier to work with in Docker. Well, in my experience. Okay, so node 18 Alpine. Now we're going to set the working directory to /user/app. Then we copy everything from the current directory to our current working directory. Run npm install to install the packages. Then lastly, we expose port 3000. That's where our backend is running. Then the start command, that's node index.js. Let me add a git ignore here. Git ignore to ignore the node modules folder. Okay, awesome. Got that all set up. Now let's create a Docker compose file. So we'll be running multiple instances of our backend image. So to easily manage that, we'll be using Docker compose. First, let's set the version of our Docker compose to 3.8. Now we create our services. So we'll have, firstly we have a service backend 1. Okay, and that's going to have a build command. So the build parts, the parts to the Docker file, that's in /backend. Then the ports, so ports 9001 on our host machine would map to ports 3000 on the Docker container. So you can access this backend 1 through localhost ports 9000, since that's referencing ports 3000 inside our container, and our app is running on ports 3000. Next, we're going to set the environment variable that we created earlier, being server index, and we set the value here to 1. Okay, now we could just copy this and paste it 2 more times, then this properly. Now this can be backend 2, backend 2, backend 3, backend 3, and we are good. To 9001. It's supposed to be 9002, 9003. Yeah. Okay, now Docker compose up. Okay, perfect. We have this all set up now. Now let's test that out. So we can duplicate this and let's check out 9001. So we see server 1, 9002, server 2, now 1003, server 3. Awesome. So now our backends are running properly. Now let's configure Nginx. So create a service for Nginx. Then we specify the image we're using. So that's going to be Nginx version 1.27.3 alpine slim. Then specify the ports. So the first port is going to be port 8C, and we're also going to have port 443. That is for HTTPS traffic. Next, we're going to specify the volumes. So that's Nginx. Wait, so I'll set up a folder. We'll have a folder where on our local machine where we have our Nginx config file. So I'll create this later on, and we would map that to where the Nginx config file is located on our Docker container. That's etc/nginx/nginx.conf. We also have a folder for our SSL certificates, so we'll also be in this Nginx folder. Cert. Then we can place this anywhere. I would do user/share/nginx/cert. Okay, and just one more thing, the depends on it's backend 1, backend 2, and backend 3. Now that this is done, let's set that all up. So firstly, we'll create a folder for Nginx. Now we create our nginx.conf file. Now let's set that up. Okay, so first declarative. So ideally, I guess you have some background on Nginx if you are watching this video, but I'll try to explain everything the best I can. So this declarative worker processes. This specifies the amount of instances of Nginx we want to run. So ideally, this is the number of cores you have on your CPU. So if it's 12 or 4. But if you don't know the amount of CPU cores you have, you can just put auto. Then it will pick that for you. Then events. Then we now specify inside that worker connections. So this is the amount of simultaneous requests each process can handle at a time. Next, we have the HTTP context. So firstly, in here, the first thing we're going to do is define our backends, upstream backend. Okay, so declare the servers that we have. So we have a server backend 1 that runs on port 3000. We have another one server backend 2, also on 3000, and backend 3 on 3000. So I'm using port 3000 here because this Nginx instance will be running on the same network as the other services in our compose file. So they see 3000, not the 9000. They see backend 1 running on 3000, not on 9000. So that's why we access it this way, backend 1 or 3000, since they're all on the same network in Docker. So we use the service name and the ports that it's running on, that the container is running on. Okay, probably not the best explanation, but yeah, basic thing is they're running on the same network, so we use the container ports. Next we declare our server. Firstly, we'll declare the HTTP server that will listen on port 80. Specify the server name, that's our domain essentially, and in this case that is localhost. Next, we specify the location option, Now this forward slash means it catches all requests. So for every request we get, what do we want to do? We want to do proxy pass. That's to forward the request to HTTP um, backend. So I forwarded those requests to this set of backend servers. So by default, it uses a round robin technique, but we'll look at how we can change that later on. But yeah, that's basically what's happened here for the semicolon. Also, we can add some headers. We can say proxy sets header. We can add the original IP, because once this request gets to our backend server, they see the request coming from our Nginx server. So we can also add the client, the IP of the original client, so our backend knows where the request is coming from. So the name of the header will be xreal IP, and to access the IP address we use remote underscore address. Now that is that. Let's now spin it up again. Okay, we have that up. So let's see. Load this. Okay, looks like something is wrong. We're back. So I figured I spelled Nginx. The name there was a typo in the name of the Nginx file, so that has been fixed now. Okay, there's an error here, so a semicolon needed to be added there. So we can restart this, and we're good. If we reload this, so we see server 1, refresh server 3, refresh server 2, then goes to 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2. So it uses a round robin technique to alternate between the servers. Ideally, if you want to use the list, another approach we could use is list con. That's the server with the least amount of connections gets the requests. Another approach we could use is weighted connections. So we could specify a weight. So this means that backend 2 gets 3 more requests than 1 and 3. So let's try that out. Restart this. Okay, I guess that's done. Okay, so server 2, server 2, server 1, server 3. So we see here server 2 gets 3 requests, then goes to server 1, then server 3. Server 2 gets 1, 2, 3 for going to server 1, then to server 3. So that's weighted. That's a weighted approach. Now let's look at SSL. Okay, so firstly we'll define. So firstly we need to get our SSL certificates. So I've already gotten my SSL certificates. So to get yours, you would have to run this command. Let me zoom this a bit. It would also be in the comments, in the description box, so you could copy and paste it. So this command generates us a self-signed certificate. So you wouldn't want to use this in production, so browsers would not flag them. If you use a self-signed certificate on a live site, browsers will flag them as unsafe because they are not verified by a certificate authority. You are essentially verifying them yourself, hence why they are called self-signed. But yeah, for testing purposes, a self-signed certificate is very easy to get. So the command I will just explain this briefly. OpenSSL, that's what we're using to generate the certificates. The risk request command says that we are requesting for a self-signed certificate valid for 365 days, specifying the number of bits. The output file for the certificates key and the output file for our certificates. So that is it. So I have mine. here. I'll just bring that in, copy this two and drag them over here. Okay, so now that that's done, we're going to create our another server. So this server is going to listen on port 443. That's the default ports for SSL. So we'll specify SSL. Then, like before, we'll specify the server name, which is also localhost. Okay. Now, once that's done, we could just copy this and bring this over here. It's the same as before. Now we specify our SSL certificates and our SSL key, SSL certificate key. Okay, so I'll come over here and copy this path. Now this would be slash Nginx dash self signed dot cert, and this would be dot key. Yeah, and this would be Nginx dash self signed dot crt. Okay, don't forget to add the semicolons, and yeah, that is that. So yeah, so this now, let's do HTTP to HTTP redirect, and that can be done in one line. So we just do return 301 to redirect status code. So we say HTTPS, then the host, then we add the request URI. Okay, that is that. Let's stop this and start it up again. Okay, now docker compose up dash d. Okay, that's all started, and we refresh, so we see it's using HTTPS, but it's not secure. Still showing not secure because we use the self-signed certificates. But we see here the HTTP works. And if we go back to HTTP, it redirects us to HTTPS, and the requests are being load balanced through all our servers. So that's it. That's how you do a load balancer with Nginx and add SSL to it. Hope you got some value from this video. Stay safe, and see you in the next one. Peace.